everyone. This is Alki Leopoulou, your host of our series Behavioral Science Talks. And as a member of the board of directors of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association here in New England, I'd like to welcome everyone from around the world, Harvard affiliates and friends, and welcome our co-sponsors, Harvard Club's Merrimack Valley, with special thanks to President Stuart Pesco, if you want to say hello.
Welcome to all of our fellow club members from north of Harvard in Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine. Hope you all are looking forward to this presentation by Bob as much as I am. And afterwards, don't forget to check out his TED presentation. You'll hear some good ideas there as well. Back to you, Alki.
Welcome to Harvard Club North Shore, Concord, and the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Relations, with special thanks to Rachel Crinklow. So in this series, we only invite researchers that use behavioral science to understand human behavior. So the recommendations here are not just based on personal judgment. Oftentimes, because of certain experiences in our lives, maybe because of major successes or failures, we can be led to create our own theories that's of what can cause something else, and perhaps share them with the world. However, the speakers here make assumptions, and then they go out there, test those assumptions, and then bring us data to support conclusions and recommendations about human behavior. So today we have here with us top 10 TED Talk speaker of all times, Robert Waldinger. What an honor. And those 19 million views that have pushed this TED Talk up the ranks show not only the quality of the talk, but also how much this subject, despite its scientific approach, matters to people. Robert Waldinger, Harvard Medical School professor, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, director of the longest study on happiness, and a Zen priest. So before we start, I'm gonna give a quick reminder. We have a very relevant talk March 18th, same time, with Professor Ethan Kross for the chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. I'm gonna paste the link for you guys to register. So let's address housekeeping and get started. So thanks for your questions. I actually rarely add questions for the speakers myself before an event, although I have to say many of you did so. But these great questions can really help inform the structure of this interview. So thank you, and please keep them coming. And here's how it's gonna go today. So part A, we're gonna explain some key concepts and talk about research findings. Part B, we're gonna talk about practical advice and how we can actually apply these findings. And then part C, open it up to Q&A for all of you. So feel free, ask questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom app, or even better, just raise your hand using the function here, and we can hear your voice. Just please keep it short and sweet. So Bob, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start our discussion just by addressing a seemingly simple, but perhaps one of the toughest questions. What is happiness?
Simple question, right? Well, we've been studying happiness for 83 years. And what I like to do first is to distinguish between happiness and well-being. So when I think about happiness, I think about how am I feeling right now talking to you? And I feel pretty happy. But this morning I got up and the heater had gone off, our furnace had gone off, and I was unhappy. And so this kind of up and down of mood is something that goes on all day long for most of us. That's different from what we think of as well-being, which is a kind of basic sense that life is okay, that life is good enough. And the reason why it's worth distinguishing is that sometimes we can get the impression that if we just do the right things, we will be happy all day long, 24/7. And that's just not true. That's not how human beings are constructed. And so it's important to remember that. And then to think about, okay, what are the conditions that support well-being that make us more likely to be happy moment to moment?
So if we had to create a happiness chart for people, how would that look like? Is there consistency? Is it going up and down a lot?
It would go up and down, but there would be a baseline for each of us, and it would be different for each of us. they've studied this and shown that actually we all have a kind of baseline level of happiness, and we circulate around that level. We go up, we're happier, less happy, and that we're different that way, and that it may have something to do with our genes, our temperament, that, you know, some people are Eeyores, they're always kind of gloomy, and some people are Tiggers, they're just bouncy and happy. But that we can change that set point to some extent. But that what the research shows is that most of us will return to that baseline level of happiness even after something really bad happens or after something really good happens. People who win the lottery, within a year, go back to their pre-lottery level of happiness. People who become paralyzed from the waist down, initially it's devastating, traumatic, but most people on average in that situation go back to their baseline level of well-being within a year.
So studies show that 40–50% of happiness is nature. And so there isn't much we can do about it. I'd like to hear your position on that.
Yes, that's an estimate. It's kind of a crude, imprecise estimate, but it's probably not bad. So let's say 40% is genetic. So does that mean that the glass is half empty or half full? If it's half empty, then, oh, there's so little we can do because 40% of it is in our genes. If it's half full, well, 60% is environmental. It's potentially under our control. And 60% is a big percentage. And so, as you know, there are many, many researchers who are doing implementation science to help people understand the practices that will allow them to have greater well-being, to be happier more often, more of the time. So the bottom line is that, yes, there's a strong genetic and temperamental component, but it is by no means the whole story. And there's lots we can do to affect our own well-being and the well-being of the people around us.
We'll talk more about what we can do later, because I think this is very interesting for people and for me personally. But I'd like to step back a little and talk about the research. So you're the fourth director of the longest study in happiness, the study of adult development, almost 80 years.
83 years.
83. All right. So a lot of studies often take a couple of months, even less. So can you talk more about the design of the study and why is the study so long? Why do you follow the lives of the same people for so many years?
Yes. Well, it's the longest study by accident. Most studies that even start out saying we're going to be a long-term study, we're going to follow people, most studies fall apart within 5 to 10 years because too many people drop out or they lose their funding or the directors retire. And so when we started in 1938, nobody dreamed that I would be talking about this study today, right? 83 years later. It's a series of lucky things, including my predecessors who were very dedicated and dogged, and the luck of funding, mostly federal funding from NIH. So you asked the question, which is so important, why do this? Why not just take a snapshot of people at different ages as they are today? Let's compare 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds on well-being, on blood cholesterol, on anything you want. Why not just compare those people? Well, the problem is that makes a set of assumptions that can be very wrong. So I'll give you an example. There was a joke from a man named Claude Pepper, who was a senator from the state of Florida. And he said, when I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish. That if you just look at a cross-section of what's happening right now, you can make some very wrong assumptions, like Cuban children end up turning into Jewish older people. And that, of course, is not what happens. But what longitudinal studies allow us to do is watch how things unfold. What happens, the chicken and egg phenomenon, which comes first? And following people over time, we can find that out. I'll give you a quick example. As you probably know, depression and alcoholism are often found together. The same person often suffers from both. If you ask people who are depressed and struggle with alcoholism, which started first, they will say almost uniformly, I got depressed first, and then I started to drink. But when we actually have followed people through their lives, more often than not, people start to drink first, and then they get depressed. So our memories are faulty, which is another very important reason for spending all the time and money and effort to follow people through their entire lives.
So that takes me to another question. Do people easily understand if they're happy or not?
It depends on what kind of happiness. So I think most of us understand how we feel right now. You could probably tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 right now, Alki, how do you feel? Give me a rating.
10.5.
Okay, well, great. Okay, and most of us could make a judgment about right now. But then there's another kind of happiness that's sometimes called eudaimonic well-being, and it's the happiness about that has to do with feeling like your life has meaning. So, good example. You're a parent of a small child, and it's 8 o'clock at night, and you've had an exhausting day, and you're sitting on your child's bed, reading to your child to get your child to go to sleep. And you've read the book Goodnight Moon 5 times, and your child is saying, Mommy, read it again, read it again. Okay, is that fun? Does that make you happy? No, but is it one of the most meaningful things you could do with your time? Absolutely. So you read it for the 6th time and you feel like, my life has some meaning to it. That's eudaimonic well-being. And so often we want to check in about both. First, how am I just feeling in terms of my mood? But then also, how do I feel about whether this is a good enough day and I'm having a good enough month, even year, although this has been such a terrible year for all of us.
So let's talk about the key findings. And you've given this famous TED Talk. It's been 5 years since then.
Yeah.
Any new interesting findings since those that you'd like to share, and what should we take home?
Since then, so we studied let me explain who we studied first, because I think some of our participants may not know. The Harvard study in 1938 started as 2 studies that didn't even know about each other. One started at the Harvard University Student Health Service by a physician who wanted to study normal young adult development. So of course, if you want to study normal young adult development, you study all white male Harvard students, right? I mean, that is the most politically incorrect sample you could possibly have. And then in addition, 2 people from Harvard Law School, Sheldon Gluck, who was a law professor, and his wife, Eleanor Gluck, a social worker, they were interested in resilience and why some children from really difficult, disadvantaged homes became delinquent and others did not. How did some children from such difficult circumstances manage to stay out of trouble? So both groups were studied with the idea that we'll study young adult development and we'll study how people make that transition from the teenage years into adulthood. So that's how it started, with 724 people altogether. And then, since I gave the TED Talk in 2015, we have been studying their children. So their children are all baby boomers, and we've studied 75% of them, which is an unheard of response rate. 75% of all the eligible children said they would participate with us. And so we've studied them as well, about studying their health, their mental health, their relationships, their work lives, their sense of meaning in life. So now we've studied one generation, we've studied the children, the second generation, and we're about to reach out to the grandchildren, to the third generation, and to some of the great-grandchildren as well.
And so if we, all right, so let's address that. So you guys are studying all these different groups of people. Are there differences in happiness between, with different genders, different culture, different age groups?
Yeah, really good question. Basically, no differences. In that almost everybody we studied ended up living a working to middle class life or above in terms of social class. So almost everybody we studied had enough to eat. They had a roof over their head. They could educate their children. And so if the basics are taken care of, and that's consistent with research all over the world that shows that if the basics of your life are taken care of, then your happiness level doesn't go up so much as you make more money. So most of the people, including the people who started out very poor and disadvantaged, ended up with reasonably happy lives. Some much more than others, but basically there weren't big differences between the inner city group and the Harvard College group in terms of levels of happiness. Women and men did not differ so much, although women are now less happy on average in marriage than men. Married people or partnered people tend to be happier than single people, but for women, marriage is less of a good deal than it is for men. But by and large, levels of happiness do not depend on gender. They don't depend on race or ethnicity. And once you get above a certain level of income, they don't depend on income.
And I guess we see that a lot in different studies that have a finding that's more universal, right? A lot of basic things and basic human things are more universal. So I think this goes to say for that finding of your study. What are the key findings to happiness? What's the secret to happiness? What should we do?
Yeah. Well, one secret will not surprise you. It's that taking care of yourself really matters. So as one participant said, take care of your body as though you're going to need it for 100 years, because you just might. And what we found was that the people who took care of themselves, who didn't smoke, who didn't abuse alcohol or drugs, the people who exercised regularly, who had regular checkups and preventive health care, those people lived longer and they stayed healthier longer. And all of that sounds like what your grandmother would tell you, right? I mean, that's not new, except that we now have lots of data behind it. And of course, not just our study, but thousands of studies all over the world, that this kind of self-care really does matter for staying healthier longer and living a longer life. But the second finding, and that's the finding that made me decide to give the TED Talk, and it was the surprise that being more connected to other people and having warmer relationships with other people didn't just keep people happier as they went through their lives, it allowed them to stay healthier and they lived longer. So the people who were more connected, who saw more people in a given week, lived longer. The people who had warmer relationships lived longer. And not only that, it wasn't just the age at which they died, it was how likely were they to get type 2 diabetes? How likely were they to get heart disease, to get arthritis? And what we found was that the people with more connections to others and warmer connections to others we're less likely to suffer from the diseases of aging, or those diseases happened later in life. So it's basically, the message is more years of healthy life. And that's what we're after, not just longer life.
Right. I want to understand a little more. When we say more good relationships, is there a limit of how many? Can there be too much of people? And is there a connection with quality? How can we balance? How can we decide?
Yes, that's a really important question. So how much is enough? How much is too much? And it depends. It really depends on what you as an individual find helpful, energizing. There are some people who are introverts, and for those people, 1 or 2 relationships is all they need and maybe all they want. That for some people who are shy, who are introverted, having more people in their life who they have to deal with every day can be agitating, can cause more stress. And we know that stress breaks down the body. For other people, having lots of people around is reassuring, energizing, exciting. For those people, having more people is what's useful. What we do find is that everybody needs to feel like someone would be there if they really needed them. So we asked our study members at one point, list the names of all the people who you could call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared. And some of our participants could list several people who they could call. Some of our participants couldn't list anyone. And they were even married, some of them, and they couldn't list a soul who they felt they could really turn to if times got really bad. So it's having that sense of a safety net, that someone has your back, someone will be there for you, that seems to be the common thread for most people. But beyond that, it really depends on what you as an individual find most helpful in your life.
So I think it's a good time to make an important clarification, because I know there's some confusion around it. Should someone be married? Is that to get the deep connection? That sounded very wrong. But are we talking about marriage equals the good deep connections, or does it not have to be just marriage?
It does not have to be just marriage. Absolutely not. There is a finding that married people live somewhat longer than single people, but that's a very crude look at it in the research. That really what we are pretty sure goes on is that it depends on the solidity and warmth of your connections. So there are many single people who don't want to be partnered or married, but who have good, solid friendships that help them feel good about going through life. Those people, we are pretty sure, get the same benefit. So the message is not, you need to rush out and get a marriage license or find a romantic partner. Not at all. It's really about the substance of your connections. That's important.
And so if we have these 2 main findings, if we are to move to practical advice based on things that you've seen work most, based on things that you've tried out and the recommendations you can give to people, how can we increase happiness? What are some practical things we can do to first increase happiness and then sustain it?
Yeah. Well, one thing is to pay attention to how your relationships are right now. Because one of the things that many of us accidentally do is we take our relationships for granted. We take our marriages or our romantic partnerships for granted. We take our friendships for granted. We assume, okay, these people have been there for me. They're always going to be there. We're good, right? But one of the things we find is that it's pretty easy for friendships and intimate relationships to wither. So I'll give you an example. People, when they have their first child, married couples, often find that the quality of their marriage can decline, not because anything is wrong, but because they get so focused on child rearing that they don't take the time to have a date night, to go for a walk, to be sure they have time to check in with each other about themselves, not just about the child. And similarly, people often lose touch with friends from high school or college or elementary school, and that these friendships then wither away. They don't have to. And what we find is that if people actually prioritize relationships, it involves making minute decisions that add up. So I'll give you an example. This weekend, I could spend most of my time working on, writing. I could spend most of my time doing email. It's the path of least resistance for me. So I have to stop and say, okay, I haven't seen my friend Ron. I want to go take a walk with him. And I reach out and say, hey, let's go take a socially distanced walk. It's those kinds of decisions. They're small, but they're really important. So that's one thing, to be more active, more proactive in not assuming that relationships will take care of themselves, but thinking of it more like, let's say more like physical fitness. Like you don't go work out at the gym once and then say, I'm good, I'm done. No, you continue, you make it a practice, as we do so many things. So do that. Another thing, particularly in times of COVID, is to be proactive, because COVID has made us all more retiring. Talk about the path of least resistance. We're told, keep your distance from people, stay away. Well, this may be a time when we need to really get active again in taking a socially distanced walk, in setting up Zoom calls. People have gotten really creative, as you know. Like we had a surprise birthday party for my son, where he thought he was just checking in for a family call on Zoom because he lives elsewhere. And suddenly all these people zoomed in from his elementary school days and from college, and so there are ways to get creative about this. But the message is, be more active in reaching out during COVID, and particularly reach out to people who are more alone, because people who are alone, particularly living alone, can often get into a mindset of that other people are fine, other people have lots to do with their lives and they don't want to hear from them. And so it often behooves us, if we are people who aren't alone, to reach out and to be more active in that regard.
So I think this is very helpful for us, and I'd like to talk more about this elephant in the room, COVID. So there are a couple of things that I want us to address. The one is, we need to be more active, proactive, as you're saying, and reach out to people. At the same time, there's this burnout that's happening to most of us, and there's all these Zoom meetings or video call meetings that are happening at our work all the time, and people feel burned out and they just can't take any more digital interactions. First of all, how much do these work, and what's your advice on dealing with this burnout?
Yeah, well, I'm working on it myself, and because I'm finding just what you're describing. I actually read a good report from Stanford that was just publicized a couple days ago, a study that showed 4 effects of video conferencing that are fatiguing, and explaining why they're fatiguing, and then giving some pointers for how to work with that. So one of the things I would say is that we need to be more active in self-care. What that means is not having the Zoom screen on full all the time, but minimizing the screen and just listening to voices, because there's something about the prolonged eye contact that is more stressful on Zoom. The other thing is making sure that there's self-care around these Zoom meetings. I mean, often people schedule meetings that go right up to 59 minutes after the hour, and then the next meeting starts on the hour. We have no break. And so we really have to be careful, especially those of us who lead meetings. End at 10 minutes of the hour. make everybody leave, make everybody get up, stretch. You know, they're being called bio breaks now. Really important, much more important than we may realize. The other thing is trying hard not to schedule back-to-back video meetings when you can. And when you can, what I find now is that when I can call in to a meeting, I will put on my headphones and I will go for a walk. And actually, I turn out to be a more attentive and better meeting participant when I'm walking around my neighborhood with my headphones on and listening and then chiming in when it's my turn. So there are a lot of things we can do. And I would encourage people to look online for that Stanford study and for some other work that's being done now to help us figure out how to manage this.
Yeah, I tried the walking myself the other day, and I think it's a great way to have a meeting, just to try to fight that. I'm wondering if there are more ways, just if we're, all right, that's very helpful for the structure of the day, of the work day. What are your recommendations for just winding down? What's your routine? What's your recommendations when the day is over?
Yes. Don't look at your phone late in the evening. Make a separation between your screen time and the time you want to go to bed. It's really true that, as we know, that screens, both physiologically, they emit light that is difficult for us. It emits light that is activating for us. So you do not want to be looking at your screen in the hour or two before you want to settle down for the evening. And similarly, as we know, media is designed to capture our attention and hold it and keep us there. So clickbait, all this agitating stuff. I mean, what I have learned is that I do not look at the news late in the day at all. I curate what I put into my mind. In fact, one of my Zen teachers has a wonderful quote that I like. She says, "Your mind is like tofu. It tastes like whatever you marinate it in." So if we are marinating our minds in agitating news, in clickbait, in all the things that social media want us to get excited about, we are making our minds be that way, right? And so we really need, especially toward the end of the day, to curate carefully what we put into our minds. And, so to settle down, to read, to meditate, to do yoga, to do things that don't involve screens and do involve a kind of settling down.
I love the tofu example. So what if tofu is, if our mind is our brain is tofu, what are your thoughts about social media and happiness, and especially with the youth?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say something obvious. Social media is not going away, right? So then the question becomes, how do we understand how we as humans interact with social media? There's a lot of research now going on. Not enough good research yet, but more and more coming about this. We know that some people use social media in ways that are helpful, that are energizing, that don't hurt them, but that make their lives better. We know that some people become depressed and suicidal when they spend time on social media. So the question that researchers are trying to investigate is, for whom is social media use detrimental? And what kind of social media use is detrimental for those people? And so what we really want to look at are what we call in the research world individual differences, to look at who's more vulnerable to the ill effects of social media and who is not, who actually does quite well with social media. And so there are some good pointers coming out about kids and social media, say from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. There are a number of good sources for that. But by and large, I would say for us as individuals, the litmus test is when I have spent 20 minutes or a half an hour on a social media site, how do I feel? Do I feel happier? Do I feel energized? Do I feel more optimistic? Or is my energy lower? Do I feel more pessimistic? Do I feel sadder? That litmus test can tell each of us a lot about what's working for us and what's not. So I would encourage each of us to do those tests on the sites that we spend time on.
So we have, all right, so we have social media, and then we have time at work. Do the connections at work count to build happiness? Can we focus on being active with those relationships? And what do you think can increase, what other practices can increase our levels of happiness? Because before we talked about burnout and protecting ourselves, but are there things we can do to increase happiness? And this happiness connected, like, do we have findings that connect happiness with performance and good quality of work and motivation?
Definitely yes to the latter. So yes, I mean, work is really important for happiness. They've started to do some good studies that have shown that 40% or more of workers say that they don't have a friend at work, that they don't have anyone at work with whom they can talk about personal matters. And what they find is that those people are less productive at work. They're more likely to leave their jobs than the people who do have a friend at work or more than one friend at work. And if you think about it, we spend so much time, so much of our waking lives in the workplace, that having people who we feel know us, at least to some extent, and to whom we can talk about our lives, that is so valuable. So bottom line is that companies can do a lot to encourage cooperation, can encourage socialization in helpful ways, and that in fact, it's not just good for us as humans, but it's good for business. It's good for the bottom line.
So I want to ask two more things and then take it to the audience for questions. How about older adults, especially during the pandemic right now? What is your advice? Can we even help others be happy? And what can we do to change the reality that they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, this is so hard. This is so hard. You know, because think about it, older adults have spent a lot of their lives anticipating a time when they'd have more freedom. Some adults who are healthy, anticipating a time when they could travel the world, or anticipating a time when they could, you know, spend all day long with other people doing the things they love to do. And so this has shut so much of that down. And then think of the people in assisted living facilities, people who are at more danger because of the facilities and because of the nature of caregiving and because the virus is so much more damaging to people who are older. So all of that has made life for older adults feel unfair in many ways. It's like, wait, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't the old age that I was promised. And so I think what we do is, first of all, we empathize with that. It's really important. I mean, someone said to me today, he's in his 80s, and he said, I haven't seen my children and grandchildren in over a year. I haven't hugged them. And he's a very vigorous, lively man who can travel, who would like to travel. And so all of that is to say, first of all, empathy, and second of all, reaching out where we can, at least remotely. And one of the things we can do is to remember that older people are not just there to be the recipients of our care. They can really help us. So one thing we can do is ask the older people in our lives, how did you get through hard times in the past? How did you get through, a crisis in your family? How did you get through a social crisis? If they're old enough, how did you get through World War II? How did you get through all the upheavals of the 1960s? How did you get through 9/11 and all the crises that happened after that? Because older people have learned lessons that younger people can benefit from. And so to remind ourselves that older people can be our teachers is really good for us all. There's a lot of wisdom there.
I'm gonna take it to the last question and then open it up to people. So feel free to raise your hands so we can hear your question. Given that a lot of the people are from the Harvard alumni from the Harvard Kennedy School, so they're in the public sector or non-governmental, non-profits, is there anything that policymakers or even citizens to promote happiness in our societies?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, there is so much. Emotional well-being started to be a pillar of the Surgeon General's platform when Vivek Murthy was Surgeon General under Barack Obama. He decided that emotional well-being was going to be at the center of his initiative because it was so important. And that meant emotional well-being for children, school children, early child education, supporting childcare so that adults have better lives, more livable lives. There's so many ways that we can invest in emotional well-being in our policies. And of course, the ripple effects of those kinds of investments are enormous in terms of decreasing levels of mental illness, decreasing levels of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, which cost our country and our world trillions of dollars. And so investing in well-being is going to do a lot to improve the mental health of the nation and the world and reduce a lot of the social ills that plague us, addictions being perhaps one of the most visible. So yes, I mean, and I know that there are a lot of initiatives at the Kennedy School around this, around policymaking that enhances social capital and social well-being.
All right, Taiba, I'm gonna have you ask first after we go to the written question. So if you want to be ready. So starting with the audience questions, I'm getting a question for if you taking care of yourself and happiness, is it causal or is it correlational?
That's a great question. So are we better able to take care of ourselves because we're happier or vice versa? And of course, there's no single direction. It is synergistic. What that means is that self-care makes us happier, and being happier gives us the energy and the optimism to invest in self-care. So one of the messages might be fake it till you make it. So how do you start that ball rolling? How do you start that virtuous cycle happening between mood and self-care? So first, put one foot in front of the other, do the self-care, because it will give you usually a little bump in mood. And that bump in mood will then give you more capacity for self-care. Similarly with relationship functioning, relationships and health work in the same synergistic way.
Taiba, I'm gonna ask you to talk now. I'm gonna give you permission. So you can unmute yourself and talk if you'd like.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. It's so interesting. I got so many questions, but yeah, I better not be greedy and give everyone a chance. So I think the most important one which popped out for me was when you had all the different generations in your study. So what correlations did you find with them, like with regard to intergenerational trauma, health, happiness? What were the key findings with it?
Yeah, such a good question. We're still doing a lot of work on that. We do find that intergenerational trauma is quite prominent, that the number of adverse childhood events in the lives of our original study members is high, even though people weren't used to reporting on that kind of thing. When we asked them to look back, events like being abused, not growing up in a household where there wasn't enough to eat, or there was a financial worry about paying the bills. So many adverse childhood experiences. And what we find is that in asking the second generation, the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences was also quite high. And what we're doing now is studying the mechanisms by which adverse childhood experiences affect our health as we get into adulthood. So we're looking at intergenerational continuities, but also discontinuities. So which families are able to prevent the transmission of trauma across generations? And what I will say is that those analyses are still going on, so stay tuned. We hope to publish some findings.
So would you think that, is it more severe in the older generation or in the newer generations, like that, whatever that symptom may be?
A lot depends on social factors. So what we know is that households that are terribly stressed, households where there's unemployment, where poverty is an issue, where there's addiction, where there's parental mental illness, those households are much more likely to transmit trauma to children. And households where those difficult factors are not there are better able to take care of children. No surprise, right? So what we find is that social factors and economic factors impact family life, and family life then has a lot to do with whether traumas of an earlier generation get transmitted to the next generation.
Yeah, so it's that same explanation of, being pre-genetically disposed, but then it depends on the environment as to how much that activates.
Exactly. The other thing we know is that some people survive trauma very differently from other people. Some people withstand adverse events without so many psychological and physical ill effects, and other people are devastated by it. There's so many reasons for that. Some of them probably are biological, and some of them are social and familial. So there's a lot of variability in what happens to people who grow up in traumatic environments.
Thank you so much, Seiba. I'm gonna move on.
Thank you very much.
A few questions that are coming up about people are asking for you to explain more about the men and women difference in a marriage, and why does it sound too big? Of course, you're gonna get it. Why is it a better deal for men than for women? Why do we have that? And then Naeem, I'm gonna ask you to talk next. So if you want to be ready.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that it is absolutely crystal clear, but some studies are pointing to a fact that every woman listening is gonna resonate with, which is that still, even in this day and age where we hope that household responsibilities are more equitably divided, that division does not happen equitably. It just doesn't. And so women are shouldering the burden much more of child rearing, of household care and maintenance, right? And at the same time, women are now in the workforce in so much greater numbers than they were 50 years ago, right? So it's often referred to as the double burden, that women are often carrying more of the load at home and almost as much of the load at work, and that's not conducive to well-being. And so again, investing in better childcare, investing in support systems for caregivers, is really important because more caregiving falls to women than to men in our society. That includes caregiving for older relatives as well. So that's the no-brainer answer to why it may be a better deal for men than women, and why we hope over time these roles will change.
All right, Naeem, you're ready.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Professor. It's an honor, and thank you, Alki, for this. I actually have a couple of questions, but I'm not going to be too greedy. I'm going to limit them to two, so feel free to answer either or both. That would be great. So we talked at first about the base level of happiness, and we said that most people return to their base levels. I'm just wondering, what are the factors that would contribute to this, and especially the people that we surround ourselves with? And the other part of the question is like, how sustainable is this change if we practice it for an extended period of time? Is this change, like if we increase our base, is it sustainable, or are we bound to return? And the other question is the variability in withstanding trauma. Could you just briefly explain the long-term effects of this, if possible, or maybe lead us to any readings that we would benefit of? Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me take one at a time, and I may have to ask you to repeat the second one. So the first one, in terms of levels of happiness, we believe that, and I believe there's some research on this, that some biological factors, particularly what we call temperament, which is a whole mix of genetic and other biological factors, that temperament does influence who are the cheerful people habitually and who are the less cheerful people. And you will sometimes hear parents say, you know, this child came out of the womb happy, and this child came out of the womb irritable, you know, and there just seem to be these temperamental tendencies that we are born with. But that said, as your question implies, very possible to change that. And you raise this interesting prospect of our networks and how much do our networks influence that. There's a lot of good research, network analysis research, that shows that there are many aspects of our lives that are contagious, if you will, that the people we associate with often influence our own behaviors and our responses to the world. And so there is some evidence that happiness may be contagious, and that surrounding yourself by people who have a brighter outlook on the world can make a difference and can support you in an ongoing way. So the bottom line is, I think there are ways to support greater well-being and therefore more happiness over time. It takes, you know, deliberateness and intention. Now, remind me, tell me again the second question that you had.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. My second question is, you talked about variability in withstanding trauma. I'm just wondering, how would this affect, like how would the ways that people deal with trauma affect their long-term well-being? If it's a long answer, I'm very fine with just the scientific name that I could search it up later.
Okay. Well, what I can tell you is that there's some genetic factors, which are actually epigenetic factors, which are really interesting, that people who are chronically stressed, and trauma is a big stressor, as you know, that stress turns on some genes, gets them to express themselves, and turns off some other genes in characteristic patterns. And we're learning more about that. We're actually studying that in our study. And so what we know is that chronic stress can turn on and off genes in characteristic ways, but that people differ in the extent to which this effect happens. In addition, the way that the environment meets someone who has been traumatized has a huge effect. So if a child is abused, could be abuse by a parent, could be being bullied. If a child tells someone and that someone believes the child and takes action to keep the child safe, that is a huge step toward helping the child survive the trauma better, right? If the child keeps it a secret, if the child is blamed for whatever has happened, If the child is not believed, that is a strong predictor that the child is going to have much worse effects over time as they grow up.
All right, thank you very much.
I have another question from the audience from actually an old classmate of mine, Steve Watkins, and he's asking if about the happiness indices indices for different countries. That some countries are identified more happy and some others not. What are your thoughts on that? And does it make sense even to move to one of those countries to change our happiness levels?
Yeah, well, it's such a good question. What I would do is refer you to the UN Happiness Report that comes out every year. And the 2020 Happiness Report has just come out. And I think that may be what the person who asked the question is referring to. They ask all over the world, they ask the same questions about what do you need to have a happy life? And there are differences, but one of the surprising things is they've been able to identify some fairly consistent factors across countries, across cultures, across genders, racial groups, socioeconomic groups, that there are some fairly consistent, stable factors that people feel they need to have a good life, a happy life. What I would say is that it's not necessarily the case that you need to move somewhere. That sometimes that helps, but in my field of psychiatry, we often talk about a geographical cure that usually doesn't work. When someone says, well, all the people in Boston are kind of nasty and cold, so I'm going to move somewhere else because it'll be better for me there. Once in a while that works, but more often than not, it doesn't work. More often than not, the better investment is trying to change your circumstances where you are and work on life where you are. But I would say go to the UN Happiness Report and look at that, because it's chock full of really useful information. Just read the executive summary. The Happiness Report is hundreds of pages, but the executive summary alone has a lot in it that people might find quite interesting.
Well, thank you so much. It's 5 o'clock for us, 12 o'clock for some other places, 4 for some others at night, in the morning, I guess. Thanks so much. I'm so glad we did it, especially during COVID time. I think this is very helpful for everyone. And thanks everyone for joining.
Alki, this was a pleasure. Thank you for the interview.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.